Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Friends and Pals podcast. We are on episode 2 today. We will be diving into the topic of D&D. I personally know nothing about the topic at all. Alex here has a little bit more knowledge, especially in the terms of being like a dungeon master. So this whole episode is going to kind of be like someone who knows the topic breaking it down to somebody who doesn't know the topic. So I hope you enjoy, and I'm going to bring it over to Alex now.
All right, so yeah, I've been playing D&D for it's probably been about 2 years now. So I'm by no means like an expert, but I've definitely spent a lot of my time behind the curtain, so to speak, as like dungeon master. I've been playing for longer than I've been a dungeon master, but I've got two groups that I play with. I typically do like 1 to 2 games a week. I've got one game, the one that I run, that goes weekly, and I've got my second game that runs bi-weekly, sometimes longer. But I've been in two campaigns as a player, and I've been in two campaigns as a DM, although I've also run a couple of things that are called one shots as a DM, and we can get into a little bit about what that is later. But I guess
Sure.
what the first thing that I kind of want to touch on is that 90% of the time when people are like, yeah, I play D&D or like Dungeons and Dragons, that's like it's a really broad term. I mean, of course, there's Dungeons and Dragons, which is like the juggernaut that carries the entire tabletop game system. But there's a lot of different things out there that people could be referring to with it. When I was first asked to join a D&D campaign, it turned out that it was this other kind of tabletop game called Warhammer that I joined. So my first
Okay.
experience with a tabletop game was actually with Warhammer, and my first time playing Dungeons and Dragons specifically was actually with the campaign that I'm running right now. But I have done, let's see if I can, I've done a campaign based off of Warhammer. I was a player in that one. The one that I'm currently running is a Star Wars tabletop game. We're running it off of a system called Force and Destiny, and I've run a campaign which was based off of the fifth edition of D&D, but it was so radically different because it was homebrewed. The entire system was homebrewed to be a Naruto version of D&D. So it's just that campaign compared to the one I'm running right now, which is just base fifth edition D&D, is fucking insanely different. So I don't even count them as the same thing. But those are the four major campaigns that I've been in. And
Before we go too much deeper, because I know you're gonna kind of be delving deep into this for a little bit, can you kind of just explain to me, I guess, in your terms, what exactly like the dungeon master is and like what you kind of do in terms of that before we start getting into campaigns and the deeper realm of it?
so the difference between the dungeon master and the player, I guess. So for me as a dungeon master, I am basically creating just about everything the players see. And it varies for a lot of people. Like the role of dungeon master can look very different between people. For me, I have never once, I suppose that's partially a lie, but I typically don't run it off of modules, which are like pre-written stories. I typically write my own, but typically as a dungeon master, you are prepping for every session. You're writing the story that you've kind of developed. You are acting out what the NPCs are saying to players. You are basically doing everything. You are reacting to what the players do in the world that you've created in a session. So the role of dungeon master can burn people out really quickly, but essentially you are the gamekeeper. You are the one who sets the rules. If you don't like what somebody's doing, you can say, "Hey, no, that's not how I'm playing this." Typically, you are the one who is enforcing the rules, creating the rules, and also creating the story and the characters that your players are interacting with. And it's a
Okay.
little different from it's a lot different from being a player. I was going to say it's a little different. It's not. As a player, you have one character that you are developing. You have one character that you are spending experience on. You are building that character, you are creating a personality for that character, and you are also learning about the NPCs, but you are creating one specific character and developing that one character. So you have a much smaller scope as a player. As a dungeon master, you are basically God in the world that you create. As the player, you are simply a pawn. But yeah, like I said, I have a lot less experience as a player, just simply because I've always run my campaigns weekly. Like I do my dungeon master games weekly. I've been doing them weekly for as long as I can remember, with some gaps when I need a week off. My campaigns as a player have typically been bi-weekly, so as a player, I have very little experience. And like I was saying, it varies a lot between the type of game you're playing. Like
Sure.
a lot of like you can be doing vastly different things depending on which system you're running it on. Like I was saying, my first D&D campaign, quote unquote, was a Warhammer Fantasy, which runs off of one type of dice. And my current campaign that I'm running as a dungeon master goes off of another type of dice. And then the Star Wars Force and Destiny campaign that I'm currently a player in runs off of a completely different system of dice. So pretty much you are kind of tailoring a certain system to the way that you want it to be as a dungeon master. But I guess the easiest way to kind of get into that is to just talk about the dice that you have. So typically, when you go
Sure.
into comic store, you see D&D dice sitting there. Typically in like a pack of D&D dice, you get. Oh God, I'm sitting here. You typically get a D4. I'm gonna have to look at my dice. You get a D4. You get a D8. You get a D6. You get a D10. A D20, of course, which is pretty much the basic Dungeons and Dragons dice thing. You get a second. To be honest, I haven't used this one other than Warhammer. I think this one's for a D100, but it's got like tenths places on it. I think it's a D10 technically, but with like tenths places on it instead. So it goes 10, 20, 30, and then a D12. So in a campaign, depending on the system you use, you're typically using one type of dice pretty specifically. My first campaign was a Warhammer campaign. You rolled pretty much D100 or whatever you wanted to do. You rolled a D100, and depending on on the number you rolled, you either succeeded or failed. It's a lot similar with Dungeons and Dragons with the fifth edition, except it's a D20 instead. So you get the numbers 1 through 20. You get a good number, you succeed. You get a bad number, you fail. And that kind of segues a little bit into how the game is played, I guess. So typically in a game of D&D, I'm just going to talk about it from the dungeon master perspective. I have written the story and I am presenting it to you as the player. I have NPCs, I have an enemy, I have a main. It's typically called like the big bad evil guy, the BBEG. But I have like the main villain in mind. I have a story in mind. I have NPCs in mind, key people that you're going to meet during your journey. But of course, you're going to not just want to sit there and listen to me talk for 3 hours, or depending on how long your campaign is. So it's pretty interactive. The beginning of every session typically begins with a recap, just reminding you of what the characters did last session, and then you launch into the actual session, which could be anywhere from, hey, we just finished up fighting this thing, and now we're going to move on to something else. Or like, for example, you guys were heading into this town that I have written, a whole bunch of NPCs for it, a whole bunch of different shops and bars and taverns and stuff like that. It'll be set up as, hey, you guys are entering, for example, a city I've done is Waterdeep. You guys are entering Waterdeep. I have a map of Waterdeep. There are taverns, there are inns, there are different guilds, kind of groups kind of scattered around. And generally, you'll have the goal of the campaign in mind. We're trying to find this person in this town. But beyond that, it's free reign. The players typically at that point are like, hey, let's go to the tavern, ask questions, see if we can't get information about this person that we're trying to find. And that can be done in a couple different ways. A lot of people like to go to the bartender and ask him, like, hey, have you heard any rumors around? Or hey, have you seen this guy wandering around? And in some systems, I don't think it's in fifth edition, but I could be wrong. In some systems, there's a bartering skill or a bribing skill, and you have a number in that skill. To use an example from Warhammer, because that one's probably the easiest one that I've had to grasp. If you have a 50 in bribing on Warhammer, I don't even know if that's a skill in that one, but it's a good example for it. If you have a 50 in bribing, you are rolling a D100. You can get any number from 1 to 100. If you get anything 50 or under, you have succeeded at bribing him. He will give you all the information you want to know. If you get anything over 50, so 51 or above, I believe. I'm not quite sure whether the cutoff is actually the number or whether it's one above, but 51 or above, you failed. You did not bribe him. He is not willing to listen to you. He's not going to give you the information you're looking for. And that goes for a lot of things that you can do in a D&D campaign. Like if you're like, hey, I want to scale this wall and jump across the roof. All right, roll an agility check for me is usually what I will say. And that you have the agility skill. It could be like a 45. You roll a 45 or under, you succeed. You roll anything above a 45, you my friend once was trying to scale a wall and failed the check to scale a wall. And the DM told him that he basically just face planted himself into the wall.
So that's kind of something I'll kind of butt in here because this is actually something I had a question on. So like the dice system. Um so how do the dungeon master decide like how much a dice roll you need to get to achieve your intended goal, or like how is that decided? I guess is my question.
So it depends on the system. Again, since we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, we'll just talk about that one. I kind of used Warhammer as an example, so we'll keep rolling with that one too because they're very different. Warhammer, you have your skill score. You have your 45, which is rolled typically the first time you create your character, and then you can upgrade it using experience. But that is the number you are trying to hit or get under in Warhammer, is your skill, which at the beginning of a campaign, you roll up characters, you roll up skills using dice. You get random numbers to put in there. And that is basically what you're trying to hit the entire time in Warhammer. In D&D 5e, it's different because in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, your skills are not like Warhammer skills. You have a D20. I'm trying to think of the easiest way to explain this. You have a D20 and you roll the d20 pretty strictly. You are rolling d20s across the board unless it's damage. For your skills, you have numbers that can be anywhere from -5 to +15, typically. And in a skill check, you roll a d20 and you add or subtract whatever you have in your skill. And so, like, somebody rolls a 15 and they have a +15 on it, they'll get a 30 on that roll. And at that point in 5e, that's when the DM decides how hard something is. So, for example, if something's really easy, the dungeon master can go, okay, this is a DC of 10. All right, I think the full I say DC a lot because my players just kind of know what it means. The actual definition of it, I want to say, is like something with challenge, like dice challenge or something like that. I don't know the full term off the top of my head, but basically it's a challenge rating. So like have you have this very easy task. Like it should be super easy for your character to do. You just have to roll above a 10. You have a task that is nearly impossible. Like you are trying to scale this metal sheet that has no foot or handholds. You are strictly just running at the wall and trying to wall run up it. That is a nearly impossible task, and you would have to roll a 30 or more to get that. So in fifth edition D&D, the DM typically is just like, all right, this seems fair based on what you're trying to do, and this is the number you have to get above or below. In something like Warhammer, it's different because you have your skill rating, and it doesn't matter how hard or easy something is. If you roll below your skill, you got it. And it can vary too, because sometimes the DM will be just like, that's not possible. But it's a lot of the DM's discretion in D&D campaigns.
Okay. Um, I know I'm probably taking a step backwards here, but I said I'm completely a noob on here. Can you briefly break down? You keep making a distinction between like 5e and Warhammer and stuff like that. Can you just break down just like briefly kind of like what the difference is and why you keep making that distinction?
So they're just different systems in terms of tabletop role playing games. I kind of briefly touched on that in the beginning, but yeah, the easiest way to explain it is they're just different ways of playing because you have Warhammer Fantasy, which in and of itself is actually as a setting is very similar to D&D. You have elves, you have dwarves, you have humans. I was trying to think of a third fantasy race that you'd have, but for some reason it's not coming to me. Pretty sure halflings are in Warhammer, but you have all the fantasy things that you know from like fantasy settings and everything. Same with D&D. They're very similar in terms of setting. The main difference between Warhammer and D&D is the way the dice are rolled. Because in Warhammer, like I said, you are rolling a D100 pretty strictly. You have a D100 and you roll that, and you can get anywhere from a 1 to a 100 on that D100. You might be able to get a 0 too, but I haven't played that in a year. It's hard for me to remember. But you are typically rolling a D100. You can get anywhere from 1 to 100 at least. You in fifth edition D&D, you are rolling a d20 unless it's for damage. So the difference between Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons specifically is in mostly mechanics as opposed to the setting, because the setting can be very similar. But that's kind of why this is a really broad spectrum, because Warhammer and D&D are very similar in terms of setting, but the mechanics make a world of difference because Warhammer is brutal. It is intense to play. D&D, the 5th edition at least, was built in a way where it is very, very hard for your player characters to die. Um, at least in my experience, and like some DMs can homebrew it to make it easier to die. But generally, as a DM, I don't like when my player characters die because I feel like it kills morale. In the 5th edition D&D, it's very hard for you to die. It's very hard for anybody in the party to die. In Warhammer, because you have the D100, you have a base skill, and it doesn't matter how easy or hard it is. If you fail it, you fuck it up. Um, and it is also really, really brutal because in Warhammer, the world is a dark and dangerous place. You are pretty much thrown to the wolves. In D&D, by the end of the campaign, typically the players' characters are gods on Earth. Like by level 20, which is the max level you can reach in a D&D campaign, the player characters are literally at a point where they can't be beat. I mean, they can be, but typically, like, it's very hard to lose once you.
They're just at a very strong level at that point where it's pretty difficult.
Yes, exactly. Meanwhile, in Warhammer, I have seen someone die on the final boss fight. Very end of the campaign, we were literally just about to kill the dude. He got one swing of his sword in, and that was the end for my friend's character.
That's gotta feel kind of bad, huh? Just a little bit.
Going into a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, you kind of have to have the mindset of I love my character, I want to see them succeed, but I have to be ready for them to die.
So you have to go in with the mindset of like, yeah, I created this character, but it's kind of like hardcore in a game where like you just have to accept the fact that you build something up, but it very well be maybe taken away from you in an instant.
Yeah, and that's why fifth edition is so much more forgiving because fifth edition you have a lot more breathing room when you die. Um, the key difference between Warhammer and fifth edition is one, the mechanics, and two, the brutality of it. The first time I ever saw a player character die was in Warhammer. And it was because it was genuinely the most shocked I have ever been in a campaign. I have never been as fucking flabbergasted as when I saw my first character death because it was a pretty hefty session. We had been trying to find this person for a while. We finally found him and gave him what we were trying to give him the entire time. But it turns out what we were trying to give him was poison and he died. And
Damn.
his companion could not speak. So his companion thought we killed him. So his companion had locked us in a room. We were all talking, trying to figure out how to get out. And all of a sudden, this NPC sticks a shotgun through the door, fires off a shot, and clips one of the characters. And we're all just like, oh, fuck, he got hit. Like, we need to figure out a way out of this room now. But then my friend Blake just goes, that takes me over my health. And the dungeon master just goes, okay, roll a D100 for me. And I think he rolled a 99, which is bad. You want to roll low if you're dying in Warhammer. And he just says, okay, I rolled a 99. And Isaac, the DM for this campaign, just goes, you guys see Prigney was his character's name. He's a dwarf. You guys just see Prigney's arm get blown off by the shotgun, and he turns around and faces you for a brief moment before he falls dead. And he was back, I think not the session after, but 2 sessions later with a new character rolled up and everything. But yeah, in Warhammer, he got shot and he died, and that was it.
Warhammer sounds fucking brutal and unforgiving. Holy shit. That was a whole storyline you just explained to me right there.
It is incredibly unforgiving. I have never had a player character in my fifth edition campaigns. I'm just gonna lump them together because they're a similar system. But in my fifth edition campaigns, I've never had a character lose a limb. I've had 2 characters die, but I mean, pretty much pulled out all the stops just because they were like, we're going to die. We want to roll new characters. But I have never had a situation where there has not been a possibility to save someone without them wanting to just go out in a blaze of glory. Like D&D 5th edition, there is so much leeway to save your friends, and there's so much leeway for your characters to keep kicking to another day. Warhammer, we had characters lose limbs. My friend's character, who, like I said, died in the very last session, he had lost an arm and both legs by the time he had died. My character, at one point, I thought he was going to die. My character, Valandiel the Elf, had a knife stabbed through his wrist and pulled down through his hand, so his left hand was unusable. He had been kicked off of a boat and damn near drowned. That was when I thought he was going to die. He didn't die. But essentially, it is in Warhammer, if you aren't playing careful, you are dead. In 5th edition, you can play it a little bit faster and looser, and you can die, but not as easily. The only thing, I guess that kind of brings up another thing that we should probably touch on, your health. In Warhammer, they're called wounds, and you typically get a set amount of wounds. You don't want to go over that set amount, so you're dead. In 5th edition, you get HP. I mean, it's if you've played a role-playing game in general before, you know what HP is. But you get your HP, which increases as you level up. So as a level 1 character, you can have anywhere from like, I've seen people start out with 6 HP up to like 20 or somewhere in that realm. Typically, you start out with that much, and then level 2, you get to get more HP. Level 3, you get even more. I think where my characters are at, they're at level 10 and they're around 80 HP. And so you get more and more leeway as you level up. Things hit harder as you level up, but you get more and more wiggle room as you level up to kind of pull off what you want to pull off. Warhammer, you got a set amount of wounds, of HP, and that's what you got. But in a typical, I think we're going to scrap the Warhammer kind of comparison at this point to kind of get into the mechanics of a D&D campaign. In a D&D campaign, what you're typically tracking over the course of a session is usually your HP. And as a for most people, it's HP. Everybody has to track HP. And beyond that, it depends on your class, which your class is how you fight. Typically, there are a lot of different classes to choose from if you wanted to dive into the nitty gritty of like expansions and I accept homebrews in my campaign. So if you go through homebrews, there are literally probably thousands of classes to choose from. But in a normal just base D&D, there's things like a barbarian, there is wizards, there's mages, there are monks, there are paladins, clerics I think is a base D&D class, and it all depends on how you play. Rogue is another really important one. I don't have a rogue in my campaign right now, but it depends on how you want to play in combat, more so how you want to play your character. Because barbarians, you get a sword and you're going to swing that sword. Same with fighters. Wizards, you're using magic to work your way around things. Rogues, you're sneaking, you're climbing up trees. I was a rogue in my first campaign, and I think that's really fucking fun, and I love playing rogues. But you're climbing up trees, you're kind of getting the drop on people. You're an assassin at that point. You might be a little squishy, low HP in terms of that, but you are stealthy as fuck. In terms of trying to think if there's any I've missed. Bards are a lot similar to mages, but bards are musicians. They get like their musical instrument, they cast spells with their musical instrument, but they're also very charming. They're good at persuasion typically, but your class is how you play your character, what you're good at in terms of either a scene or a combat encounter. And then, of course, there's races on top of that, which your race is pretty self-explanatory, like elf, dwarf, human, halfling. Um, I almost said a tiefling, but he went with a gnome instead.
Um, if you don't mind, and if it doesn't take us too much off course for where you're trying to go, can you maybe just do a basic breakdown of the class system for me a little bit? Is there certain advantages and disadvantages of picking a certain character in a certain class?
Typically, yes, and I mean, there is and there isn't. You get advantages and disadvantages whichever race you pick. Typically, human is the most basic out of them. Um, and that sounds exactly like it is. Like everybody accepts humans for what they are. I mean, humans, you don't get a lot of bonuses, you don't get a lot of negatives. You're as a human, you are kind of flat rate, like you get what you get. Elves have some bonuses in terms of agility and stuff like that because they tend to be a lot more like agile and fluid in their motions. Their muscles are kind of built differently. Um, Dwarves are short and stocky. But races and classes, there's no real like, hey, if you're picking this race, you cannot pick this class. I mean, there can be like if a DM is just like, hey, a dwarf rogue just isn't gonna work. But typically, like if you're doing like a race, there's a race you want to play, you can do whatever you want in terms of class. The races give you some benefits, but typically it's just whatever race you want to play. I mean, elves, like I said, get agility. Dwarves know a lot about stone work and stuff like that, and they tend to be very hardy and stocky. They get strength bonuses, I think, if I remember correctly. Your race typically more so affects how you interact with the world, and your class is typically what you're good at versus what you're not good at. Is there
That
a little bit more to what you were wanting me to go into? Like, were you wanting me to go into anything specific?
No. Like I said, going into this, I am like just a complete noob. So just just like as you provide information, I just want like I don't want you to spend 3 hours on a specific topic explaining something to me, but just some basic background information is helpful for me to like just understand what we're talking about going forward. So yeah, no, that was perfect.
Okay, and in terms of D&D 5e, I mean, it's pretty simple to grasp as long as you've seen like a fantasy setting before. Like, you know what elves are like, you know what dwarves are like, you know what gnomes are like. Like, if you have a basic concept of a race, you pretty much know how that race is going to end up. The classes are very similar too. Like, they're pretty self-explanatory. The only one that I'd say is a little iffy is bard. I mean, a lot of people don't know what you would do as a musician, but they can actually be pretty powerful if you develop them right the way. But yeah, so in terms of player character creation, you pick a race, you pick a class, you get your HP from your class, your starting HP, and in a fifth edition campaign, as you level up, you get class abilities. So you get certain abilities from your class that will help you as the campaign progresses. For example, a monk gets an extra attack at a certain level, so you can attack twice in a turn. I think a paladin gets that too later on. You get certain abilities tailored to that class that will give you bonuses in certain spots. Like maybe you get proficiency in stealth. Maybe you get like really, really good at shooting bows. And with that, I kind of said a word that I said a word that you probably don't know the background behind. Proficiency is a bonus you get. So I mentioned earlier you roll a d20 pretty strictly for a skill check. Skills can range from like agility to stealth to magic to persuasion, intimidation, stuff like that. Basic role playing game stuff. But you roll a d20 and you can pick skill proficiencies in the rolling of a character. So like when you're first creating your character, you get skill proficiencies, and those add an extra bonus onto a roll. So you get, let's take a step back. In creating a character, you get 6 basic ability scores. Your ability scores are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Those are the 6 basic scores you get. And those typically don't change a lot. On top of those will impact all of your skills, which can be agility, intimidation, persuasion. Like, for example, your charisma ability score will either give you a bonus or a negative to your persuasion. And on top of that, there's something called proficiency. You start out with, I think, a 3 proficiency. It could be lower. But if you have proficiency in a skill, you get to add that +3 every time you're rolling a d20 for that skill. And that
Yeah.
bumps up as you level up too. So I think at level 10, my players have a +4 right now. So in terms of like rolling a stat, rolling like if you're trying to persuade someone to do something for you, you get 2 bonuses. You get a bonus from your proficiency if you have proficiency in that skill. If not, you do not get it. And then you also have the bonus from whatever your charisma gives you. And in terms of choosing your ability scores, there's a couple of different ways to get to a score that you want. Typically, you kind of think it out. You can either roll it up, which is what people do. You get random numbers to throw in there. You can do what's called the standard array, which gives you 6 numbers to choose from, and you just kind of are like, I want this number here, I want this number here, I want this number here. But regardless, you end up with a score from 0 to 20 in your ability scores. Typically, nobody has below an 8, or at least ideally, nobody has below an 8 in an ability score.
What happens if you do have below an 8 for an ability score?
Yeah, so here's where that comes into play. Like I was saying, your ability score is from 0 to 20. You cannot go above 20, you cannot go below 0. 10 is base. So if you have an ability score that's 10, you get a 0 bonus onto a dice roll with that skill. So to
Damn.
use a example actually with perception, trying to see things, that's based off of is it intelligence or wisdom? Persuasion. We'll go with that one. That one's an easy one. You go off charisma. If you have a 10 in charisma, your charisma is adding nothing to your persuasion. It is a 0 across the board. If you have proficiency in persuasion, it adds a +3 from your proficiency. But if you have a 10 in charisma, you are going nowhere with your persuasion in terms of your charisma. And beyond that, it increases by factors of 2. If you have a 12 in charisma, it's a +1. If you have a 14 in charisma, it's a +2. If you have an 8 in charisma, it's a -1 to that skill. So, to bring an example from my current 5e campaign that I'm running, one of my characters has a 8 for wisdom. Perception is wisdom. I've settled on that. One of my player characters has an 8 in wisdom. Every time I ask him to roll a perception check, he did not have proficiency and he has an 8 in wisdom. So he is rolling a d20 and subtracting 1 from whatever he rolls every time because he has an 8 in wisdom. There have been a couple of times where he has rolled a 0 and everybody's giving him shit for it because that means his character's blind as a bat. It doesn't get much worse than a 0. It can, but it doesn't get much worse than a 0. But yeah, your ability scores, like I said, range from 0 to 20, and that impacts your skills at that point.
Is there ability scores? So how you were like distinguishing between like perception and like all that? Does the ability score affect different like attributes that you have, or like how does that work?
So ability scores typically, like I said, you get the 6 of them, and each ability score corresponds to a specific number of skills. They vary between ability scores, but each ability, each of the basic stats, strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, constitution, typically relate to a certain number of skills. Can be anywhere. I don't know specific numbers for that off the top of my head, I don't think, but each skill has an ability score tied to it. So, for example, persuasion is based off of charisma. Athletics is based off of strength. There's one called acrobatics that's based off of dexterity. Stealth is also based off of dexterity. So each skill is based off of an ability score. So your ability score will either give you a plus or a minus in every skill that you have. There's no skill that doesn't tie back to an ability score. So
I'm with you.
that's where kind of how you want to play your character comes into play because you typically get one chance to buff your character's ability scores to where you can play a class in a playable way. And that is that character creation. You are choosing what number goes into what ability score. So, for example, bards, they roll their magic off of charisma. You want to put the highest number you have in charisma if you're planning on using magic a decent amount. Fighters, put as much as you can into strength because you are going to be using strength to swing your hammer or swing your sword as much as you want. So, I said you get one chance to buff your ability scores to where you want it to be. It moves a little bit because every 4 levels you get another 2 points to put into an ability score. But if you don't start out strong, you're not really going to get to where you want to be. And that's kind of where the strategy comes into play when you're trying to build a character because you don't want to be a mage with a low intelligence. It could be kind of funny. I mean, I shouldn't say you don't want to be because it could be kind of fun to play a mage with low intelligence, but maybe I don't know. But you don't want to be a mage with a low stat.
So like an ideal mage, and if I'm understanding correctly, would have higher intelligence, like as a logistical, like real character,
Yes.
versus if you were just trying to have fun.
If you want to have a strong mage with strong magic, you buff your intelligence score.
So I have a mini question here. So there's a whole like stat system, and the only example I can use is like Fallout. So there's like a special system in D&D, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay.
So you have like I think in Fallout it's a little different because typically you have like you have the special stats which are strength and I want to say perception. I haven't looked at the
It's
special
strength,
stats.
perception,
Charisma,
something in the E,
endurance.
endurance. Yeah. Oh
eh,
yeah, endurance.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, you basically like your special stats would be your ability scores, and then your specific like abilities. And I think in Fallout 4 is you have. I think Fallout 4. No, actually, that Fallout is a really good example because the earlier Fallout games, like Fallout 3, I guess I haven't played 1 or 2, but Fallout 3, used the D&D system, because you rolled it will auto roll a d20, and depending on how well you do determines whether you succeed or fail. Like I think old school, like at least I'm pretty sure I'm thinking of Fallout. You get like a 66% chance of succeeding at a charisma check for a specific dialogue chain. You could try it and you might fail it, but you get a 66% chance of succeeding. And I'm not sure how the math works out there, but it's basically, yeah, it's the same thing. You get the base charisma, intelligence, stuff like that. And then off of that, you have these trees of skills that you can upgrade.
I'm looking at our time here. I don't know. Are we going for an hour? Are we gonna go for like an hour 20? Like what are we looking at? Because if we're gonna try and wrap it up here at like an hour, I would say maybe let's look at our final points. But if you're fine with going a little bit longer, I'm fine with going a little bit longer if you have some more points that you want to touch upon.
I think that's pretty much like, I mean, at this point, I've kind of explained the basic system. I think I can go a little bit more into
Yeah.
like details, but like I think that's pretty much the basic system. I might have done a really bad job of explaining it, but that's pretty much like basics like of D&D.
You did well enough for somebody that doesn't play the game or has never played the game to understand it. So I think you did well enough.
That's good. Yeah, I can go a little bit into specifics of like of dungeon mastery type stuff, and then we can wrap it up.
Just yeah, just kind of go through your basics, your last summary, if you will, of what you want, and then we can kind of wrap it up here.
All right. So yeah, so as like a dungeon master, as I was kind of saying before, I'm the one who writes the story. I create the world. I act out what the NPCs are saying and doing. I describe the world around you, and the player characters react to it. They're like, "Hey, I want to do this cool flip over this box to try and get the drop on this person." Okay, roll an athletics check. You roll a d20, you get a bonus based off of your ability score as well as your proficiency in that skill if you have it. And if it rolls over a certain number, you get the check and you succeed. You do that cool flip over the box. And if you fail, you don't do the cool flip over the box. And that's kind of where my role comes in as DM. I get to tell you what to do at that point. You wanted to flip over the box, but instead you tripped over your shoelace and you end up face planting right into the box. So that's kind of where I come into play. If you fail or if somebody does something to you, that's where I get to have a little bit of fun and I get to be like, no, this dude cast fireball on you instead, and now you're incinerated. Yeah, that's pretty much the basics of it, I guess. That's kind of overview of how you would play a D&D campaign.
So if you're feeling comfortable in your explanation, I have one question. I guess I have two questions for you. One leads into the second. All right. First question: do you do any of these games like online? No.
Yeah, so I do pretty much everything online now, actually. My first campaign started out in person. We had physical dice, we rolled physical dice. But since then the people I used to play with have kind of moved around the state that we're in, and we all kind of live a couple hours away from each other. Last summer, we planned a night where we all kind of met up in one town and kind of played in person again for the first time in a while. But typically, or I shouldn't even say typically, now everything I do is online. We typically hop on a voice chat in Discord to have the voice component of it. I know at one point my former DM was talking about wanting to do video as well, which you can do because it helps with the role play. But the way to play online, the way to actually roll the dice, is if somebody has physical dice, I'm typically like word, like I'll take you at your word. You roll your physical dice, you tell me what you get. But if somebody does not have physical dice, the easiest way to do it that I've been using for forever is a thing called Roll20. And it has basically just commands, computer commands, and it's like slash roll 1d20, and it'll roll the d20 for you and just gives you a random number. I know Google can actually do that too. If you type roll 1d20 into Google, Google will roll a d20 for you. I know one other way to play it is some people use a software. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I've never used it, so I don't remember off the top of my head, I don't think. But some people use a software for it. It's called something like, I want to say Forge, but that might even be something completely different. But some people use a software, you have to pay money for it, so I haven't really gone into that side of things. But Roll20 is free, and I've been using Roll20 for a while. Your B question?
Well, my B question was a little bit more of a personal question. Is there a day when we get together next that you're willing to do a mini teaching session of actually teaching me a little bit how to play?
Yeah, going like hands on into it. Yeah, we can do that.
Just maybe not even something that we like sit and record or anything, but I have a genuine interest in like actually learning it a little bit. And so like doing like having you break it down to me is great. It's good for like understanding it in practice, but like until you do it and like break it down, it's a little bit more yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. It's a lot easier to grasp things when seeing a character sheet, because you see like the name, you see things like your character class, your race, your level. You see the ability scores on the left. You see the skills right next to that, HP, stuff like that. You see your abilities, you see your equipment, which can be like swords, weaponry, or it could be your loot from the recent battle you had. It's a lot easier to grasp things when you're looking at the physical character sheet because I feel like I just threw a whole bunch of information out there. But it's a lot easier to grasp when you're looking at a character sheet because it kind of has everything in its own little box and it's a lot easier to grasp. But yeah, no, I mean, I can go through a kind of tutorial on like rolling up a character and everything in terms of like in terms of a campaign. I have looked into doing like a they call them duos, but it's a lot more there's a lot more communication that goes into a duo because basically it's a DM running it for one player, and that can get a little dicey if you roll it as a if you do it as a regular campaign, just because it's one man against the world. So it's a lot more like, hey, what do you want to see in the next session, or like, hey, what do you think would be a cool plot thread, or maybe not even that. It's just mostly like you have to have a lot more communication because you don't have a healer, you don't have like the wizard that can cast a spell that saves you from getting hit. You don't have the barbarian that can just whack the thing in the head and kill it in one shot. It takes a lot more communication in a duo, but a lot of people do them. I know during COVID it was a really big thing for two people to just get together and do a duo. Just because it's the same thing. It just requires a lot more communication since there's only two parties in play.
No, yeah, no. I'm not trying to ask you to like start a whole duo campaign. I'm more so like if you can just like I don't know, maybe I could create a character or something over like a chat one day or something. It'll probably be a while out before I'm ready to do something like that just till I understand like the fundamentals and the basics and like everything a little bit more, but it's something definitely that I'd be interested in doing at some point if down the road we want to get there.
Yeah, I mean D&D is fun. It's honestly I feel like I'm kind of a closet nerd because D&D is not like a hobby that I typically like. I'm just like, hey, I play D&D, but it's probably one of the more fun things that I've started doing. I'd wanted to join a D&D campaign for a while, and I have enjoyed every minute of it. I love I also kind of touched on the fact that I'm kind of a forever DM is what they call it. My campaigns that I run weekly, there is probably never going to be a time in the history of mankind that I will be a player character for someone in that party. I'm always going to DM for that group. And that's fine. I love being a DM. I love writing the story and coming up with characters and stuff like that. It's one of my favorite things in the world.
Well, I also your comment about feeling like a closet nerd. I don't feel like that. A, I think it's okay in 2023 to say that you're a nerd, but B, or I should say there's like a C to this actually too. B, you're talking to me. I've been your friend for 17 years. You know that I'm a big fucking nerd too. And like C, like like I don't know, like it's fucking cool. Like it's a fan. It seems like if you're the type of person that loves like a fantasy setting and like stuff like that, like this would be like a perfect. It seems like a perfect dream for somebody that loves like fantasy settings and like creating a character like RPG type shit. Like it seems like that's like a wet dream for somebody in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. And like I'm not saying that I'm a closet nerd because I'm embarrassed about it. It's just not something I typically share. Like it's just not something like, hey, I play D&D, because that's not like it's not something that I'm ashamed to share, because a lot of people do think D&D is cool, especially nowadays. It's just something I don't typically share for no real like specific reason. But
I understand. It's one of those things where it's not even like this specific topic, but it does get difficult to kind of share your interests with people because when you share something with somebody that you're into and they give you kind of like a mixed reaction, like even though it's not really something malicious on their part, it does kind of get at you a little bit. So I completely understand. Not something you're ashamed of, but not something you're looking for like bad reactions to.
I think the reason why I don't talk about it a whole lot in my personal life is just simply because while D&D is largely accepted, it's not easy to find people who play D&D. At least not in my circle, really. I mean, I feel like I know a lot of people who play D&D, or a lot of people who are like, "Hey, I've heard you play D&D. I'm interested in trying it out." Like I feel like I met a lot of people who are like, "Hey, D&D sounds cool," or "Hey, D&D like looks cool." I don't meet a lot of people who play. And so like diving into like how I play D&D is just a lot of people are like, "Oh, D&D seems super cool. Like that sounds fun." And then that's kind of just the end of it. And like so if I'm meeting someone who's like a D&D player, that's when I'll go into it a little bit more. But in terms of like, I just feel like I meet a lot more people who are like, "Oh, that sounds cool," or "Oh, that's like that like I would like to try it out." And that's not a bad thing. Like I feel like everybody deserves a shot to at least try it, because it is a really fun thing to do in your spare time. It is so fun. But I feel like while D&D is largely accepted, it's still a little hard to find people who like to play it, or who do play it regularly, at least in the people that I typically meet. Which, like I said, not a bad thing. I love introducing people to D&D. I shouldn't say my entire current, but 90% of my current group that I DM for, I'm their first DM, and I am the only DM they've ever had, which gives me a lot of leeway in some spots, but also is really fun for them and fun for me, because they're learning things and I'm able to kind of be that guide to be like, hey, this is how things work. This is how you do this. This is how you do this, which I really enjoy. It's one of the things I enjoy about DMing.
And you've been DMing for, I mean, maybe not the specific group, but you've been DMing at least for a while, right?
I want to say about, oh, how long has it been? I want to say about 2 years now, maybe a year and a half.
Yeah,
I've been DMing
at
for a
least a year
while.
and a half.
And one of my yeah, I love DMing at this point. I always kind of figured that I would love it, like when I started out as a player character. But yeah, after DMing for about 2 years now, I still love it just as much as when I first started, because writing the story and coming up with the characters and the setting and the people that people run into, that is one of my favorite things in the world. Like I have come up with some of my favorite plot points. Like my first campaign that I ran, my party's mentor turned out to be the big bad evil guy. And I think that is my favorite plot twist I've ever run, because they were traveling with this guy for 6 months of a D&D campaign. And then 6 months in, I did the switcheroo where he was like, "Yeah, I've been the one fucking you guys over the entire time." And that is one of my favorite things to do. My other favorite thing to do is killing NPCs. Yeah, I being a DM makes you very, very ruthless. You want to see your player character suffer in some way. I just recently in my campaign not killed, but she's going to be gone for a while if she's not dead. But one of the most important NPCs that they'd been traveling with for a while, out the door. She is, without going into specifics, she is gone for now. I love pulling like plot twists and big like gasp moments. Like you can't do them all the time, obviously, but I love doing stuff like that. And that's why being a DM is so fun. Like you being a DM as a whole is really fulfilling and you can really kind of tailor it to your style. Like I've heard of DMs who they plan everything out to a T. Like they're like, all right, this city, this thing's gonna happen. This city, this thing's gonna happen. There's gonna be a dungeon here with this loot in it. Or there can be DMs who are just like, all right, I've got a session tonight. Don't know what I'm gonna do, but something's gonna happen. And then fly off the seat of the cup and improv something. I'm kind of a mix between the two. I have a general outline of what's going to happen and a general idea of what's happening in each location that they're in. But one of my favorite sessions I've ever ran has been fully improv. They walked right into this small cottage that turned out was a witch's hut, and they had to fight a witch that was going to feed the gnome to the dwarf by cooking him in the oven. And
God
that
damn.
is one of my favorite sessions that I've ever done. And it was purely like if they went into a door that I had nothing planned for. And so the entire session, I was just flying off the seat of the cuff, just trying to make things work. And in the end, it all came together. And that NPC, that witch enemy, actually came back recently. And I was able to tie her into the larger campaign in some way. So yeah, I just being a player character is so fun because I love developing my character in my other campaign that I'm in. I love interacting with the world, but being a DM is something that I don't think I'll ever want to let go of. I love crafting the world and fucking my friends over and at the end of the day, like I love writing the story and being the one who gets to present this story and this information to a group of people who are very interested in it.
Hell yeah. I mean, very well said. I love that you're being so passionate, and I hate to try and feel like I'm rushing, but we're pushing the 1 hour and 3 minute mark. So yeah, I think if you want to give your closing statements, go ahead and give your last closing statements. I've had so much fun with this, honestly. I really like it. There might be a part two to this.
I think we could probably do a part two, yeah. Because like there's a lot more that I could go into. Like we haven't even touched on the system for Star Wars Force and Destiny yet.
Which we should have, literally, because the May 4th today. We should have touched on the Star Wars thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a ton about the system compared to the other ones I've ran, to be fair. But yeah, no, there's definitely like we could do an entire series on this. Like I could keep diving.
I'm honestly down to make it like a series where we just kind of make this like every once in a while we go into this and break it down. We can make this a series. I'm down. I really like this.
All right. But yeah, closing remarks. I guess to summarize, like that's pretty much like the system for D&D and also a little bit about why I love playing D&D and running campaigns. It's kind of a difficult system to grasp at first for newcomers, and I've seen it happen where people kind of just don't get it and they kind of just drop out, which happens. But once you get going with it, like I can sit here and explain it to people as much as I want, but once you get rolling with it and actually experience it, it is genuinely one of the most fun hobbies I've ever picked up. I love playing D&D.
I mean, we've had kind of conversations about it in the past, and I've been interested, but especially after the night, it's something that I'm definitely interested in pursuing for sure.
It's basically just like a role-playing game that you'd play on like a PlayStation, but it's you don't need a PlayStation for it. You get the dice.
Yeah, it's not a controller; it's a dice. Pretty much the only difference in that aspect. Yeah, hell yeah.
All right. Well, I think that probably closes us out for this episode. This one's a little bit longer than the last one, like double the length probably. But I had a good time talking about it. I liked explaining it. I liked explaining one of my hobbies. It's pretty fun to me.
Yeah, no, it was definitely a fun experience. Maybe I'm just a little bit biased on that, but it's fun being your friend, watching you explain a hobby that you're passionate about and kind of getting to go into a little bit. I really did like this episode. So yeah, this is probably going to become a series. Everybody, if you liked this episode, please come back to the next one. We've got social medias and every link. Leave a like if you're on YouTube. Subscribe if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And yeah, just keep on the lookout. We will be coming back with another episode very soon.